In Chapter 5, we're going to take a look at eukaryotic microorganisms. And remember, these include the fungi and the protists. So we'll take a look at the fungi first. So remember that mycology means the study of fungi. And remember, if you see the prefix "myc", that always means fungus. And also we talked about before how fungi acquire their food by absorbing it from the environment. And most fungi are what we call saprophytes, meaning they like to eat dead things. But a few of them are harmful to plants and animals and are parasites of them. So fungi and mold, the microscopic ones, exist in two forms. So we have the molds and the yeast. And remember the difference between them, the molds are multicellular and the yeast are unicellular. Their cell wall is made out of a carbohydrate called chitin. So that's spelled C-H-I-T-I-N. So chitin is what their cell wall is made out of. What's also unique about the fungi is that they reproduce by forming spores. So that could be either sexually or asexually. This is just a picture of the life cycle of fungi, just showing you that they can reproduce asexually by using mitosis, and then they can also do sexual reproduction by using meiosis. But both ways that they reproduce, they do use these spores. As far as how fungi spend most of their life cycle, they spend most of their life cycle being haploid. So, which is really different from animals, which spend most of our life cycle as diploid. So as soon as the zygote is formed, the fertilized egg, it actually divides by meiosis, cuts the number of chromosomes in half, becomes haploid, and then can reproduce asexually by mitosis and form the mycelium. So looking at the spores, you can actually use that to identify the type of fungi that you're looking at because they do come in some different shapes. You do not need to know any of these. And then just to answer the question over here, are asexual spores produced by mitosis or meiosis? So remember, if asexual reproduction is being used, that's mitosis. So they're creating clones of themselves. The cells are all going to be genetically identical. So molds are multicellular, and the cells are long and skinny. So you can see on the bottom left the hyphae. So those are the long skinny cells that when they clump all together, they form the fuzzy structure that you can see on the bread mold, and that would be the mycelium. So the reason that the mold have these long skinny hyphae is because it increases their surface area. And so that's a big advantage because of how they get their food. So remember, they're going to be absorbing it from the environment. So the hyphae, looking at the individual mold cells, can either be septate hypha, which means they have a septum or a wall in between the individual cells, or they can be cenocytic hyphae. So cenocytic, the first part, ceno, notice there's a co in the name, and that just means together. So it just means that the cells have fused together and there's actually no cell wall in between them. And then the picture on the right is just showing you the spore and how the hyphae will grow out from the spores. The yeast are unicellular, and when they divide by a process called budding, which uses mitosis, and they end up looking like these little peanuts or snowmen that are over here on the right. We also have some fungi that are dimorphic, and the word dimorphic, di means two, morph means shape or form. So the dimorphic fungi can either grow as a mold or a yeast. So a lot of the fungi that are pathogenic and cause disease in people are dimorphic. So which form they take depends on the temperature. So in the environment where it's cooler, they take the mold form, but then when you inhale that and it gets into your lungs, at the warmer body temperature, then they turn into the yeast. So here's a picture of dimorphic fungi, and you can actually see the yeast, the unicellular round cells there, and then you can see the long, skinny hyphae that make up the multicellular mold form. So there's about 50 different species of fungi that cause disease in humans, and disease that's caused by fungi are called mycoses. So we can classify the fungal diseases, the mycoses, depending on where they occur in the body. So if they're just going to be superficial or cutaneous or subcutaneous, so that would be like in the skin, like you can see on this child's cheek over here on the bottom left, we've got ringworm. It's not a worm, it's actually a fungus. And then over here on the right, we've got thrush, which is caused by yeast that's gotten on the tongue and overgrown. We also have systemic mycoses, and these are the ones that get inside your body and then they spread from there. Most of these are going to be inhaled from dust blowing up from the soil, and they're going to be dimorphic, meaning that they'll be in the mold form in the soil, and then when they get inside your body, they turn into the yeast form. A good example of a systemic mycosis is coccidioides, which is a cause of valley fever, which occurs in Arizona and Central Valley of California, and we'll talk about that one later. Some of the fungal infections are opportunistic, meaning they don't normally cause disease, but they can if they see an opportunity, like maybe your immune system's down, or maybe you've been on antibiotics and you've wiped out some of the bacteria in your microbiome. So an example of an opportunistic mycosis would actually be thrush. So the protists, our other group of eukaryotic microorganisms, are a very diverse group. Most of them are going to be unicellular, but there are a few that are multicellular. So we have 3 different types of protists. We've got the algae, which are photosynthetic. They do have chloroplasts, and so they are very similar to plants. And then we have the protozoans, which are more like animals because they ingest their food. And then we have the slime molds, which, remember, those are the weird ones. They act like a protozoan in that they move around like amoeba and ingest their food in part of their life cycle. And then when they go to reproduce, they're like the fungi and they form spores. So they're actually in the process of reclassifying all of the protists. You don't need to memorize any of this, but it's just interesting to see where they're putting some of these protists onto the evolutionary tree. All right, so the first protists we'll talk about are the algae. So remember, they're photosynthetic and they produce oxygen. They can be either unicellular or multicellular. An example there would be seaweed. They're a very diverse group and include things like dinoflagellates, diatoms, and then there's a bunch of different types of algae. They've named them based on their color. The algae are a very important part of the food chain, especially in the ocean and in lakes and rivers. They're kind of the bottom of the food chain and kind of help support the higher organisms. We can use the algae for food. You can obviously eat seaweed. The agar that we use to grow the bacteria on the culture media in the lab is a gel-like material that's solid at room temperature, and that actually comes from red algae, so that's where that was made from. And they use that to grow the bacteria because the bacteria can't actually break down that agar. So it's a good substance to use. If you read food labels, you might notice that carrageenan might be added to the food, and it's just a thickener that they'll add to some foods. Some of the algae will overgrow in water and can actually produce toxins. So when we think of red tides that we see in the ocean, that's actually from the algae. This just shows you the diversity of algae. So if we start up here on the top left, so this is called a dinoflagellate. And so you can see they have a flagellum, and that's part of how they got their name. These like to live in the ocean and lakes, streams. And then we've got some kelp over here, which is a multicellular algae. So they can actually grow to be fairly large. And then we've got some red algae over here. And then next we've got green algae. And then in the middle, we have some diatoms. And some of the diatoms are actually bioluminescent in that they will glow in the dark if they're disturbed. So there are certain places that you can actually see this. I understand that there's a place that you can go sea kayaking in around Seattle where you can actually see these, which would be really cool. On the bottom are volvox, another green algae. And then over here on the bottom left, this is a red tide. So these red tides are actually produced by an overgrowth of certain dinoflagellates, and they produce a toxin that will kill marine wildlife and then also can kill people as well. The next group of protists are the protozoans, which are animal-like in that they ingest their food. They're all going to be unicellular. They oftentimes come in two different forms. So if we look at Giardia over here on the left, the trophozoite is the one on the right, and that's the feeding form. So that's the one that's going to be attached to the inside of your intestines and causing the diarrhea. But when the Giardia comes out in the stool, it actually will curl up and form a cyst. And for some of the protozoan species, they also call it an oocyst. And this allows them to survive any adverse conditions. And they go dormant. They're not as tough as a bacterial endospore, but it does allow them to survive and then infect the next host. The protozoans will move around by either flagellia, cilia, or pseudopods, the false feet, like the amoeba. And they can either reproduce sexually or asexually. So you don't need to know about these types of asexual or sexual reproduction. We'll kind of talk about some of those a little bit later. And then this is just a slide just showing you how the protozoans move. So some of them, like the paramecium, are covered with cilia. Others, like the amoeba, will make the pseudopods or the false feet and kind of pull themselves along. And then other ones, like this euglena here, have flagella to move. So this picture, all I want you to notice is that these protozoans are very interesting in that they have a very rudimentary GI tract. So they have kind of like their mouth here called the cytosome, which you don't have to memorize. And they will ingest their food by endocytosis. And then any waste products, they move out of the cell by exocytosis. So just kind of interesting. You can see how this eventually developed into the GI tract. And this is just showing you reproduction in the protozoans. The larger picture is showing you sexual reproduction. They will actually swap copies of their micronucleus, and those will combine and then they form new cells, which are genetically different from the parents. And then here's just showing you asexual reproduction on the bottom left in a euglena. They're just using mitosis to make an exact copy. And so the daughter cells will be genetically identical to each other and to the parent. And they've given it the name fission. Fission just means to split. Okay, so we'll just look at some of the medically important protozoans. And again, you don't need to memorize which ones are part of super kingdom excavata or anything like that. So don't worry about those names. Okay, so our first protozoan parasite is Giardia intestinalis. And this is a really gross electron microscope view over here on the right. And you can see all the Giardia that are lining the inside of the intestine. And they actually have a little suction cup is how they stick to the inside of the intestines. So it makes it very difficult for you to absorb food. And so it just goes out the other end as diarrhea. The next one is Trichomonas vaginalis. We watched a picture of it swimming around, and this species of Trichomonas actually is a sexually transmitted disease, which is pretty gross. The next group we have Trypanosoma. These are going to be spread by insect bites. An example would be African sleeping sickness, which is spread by the bite of the tsetse fly. And this trypanosoma eventually will get into the brain and then start to cause neurologic problems. And here are just some pictures of some of our protozoans. So over here, the two pictures on the top right, these are Giardia. So notice on the middle picture, this is the trophozoite form, the feeding form. And then when it comes out into the stool to survive poor environmental conditions, it'll form the cyst. And that's what gets ingested in the contaminated water for the next person to get Giardia. And then the bottom left picture is Trichomonas vaginalis, which swims around the reproductive tract with its flagella. So those are sexually transmitted. And then this one that's on the bottom right, these are euglena, which are very interesting. They live in fresh water. They are photosynthetic. They do have chloroplasts, but they're kind of like a cross between a plant and an animal. So they can do photosynthesis, but if the sun's not out and they're hungry, they can ingest their food like the protozoans. So those are kind of interesting. Okay, and then here's an amoeba, one of our protozoans. So they like to move by the pseudopods, the false feet. And this is a picture of Entamoeba histolytica. So this one causes amoebic dysentery. So causes bloody diarrhea. And usually this is going to be picked up in tropical countries. So this is not something you have to worry catching here. Okay, our next group of protozoans, the group is called Apicomplexa. You don't have to memorize that, but you might see it later on in your healthcare classes. These are a pretty diverse group, and they all are obligate intracellular parasites, meaning they're required to live inside of our cells. They also have very crazy, complex life cycles that are very difficult to learn, which I will not make you do. The first one, Plasmodium, you can see on the bottom left picture, these are some red blood cells, and inside you can see the little purple ring-shaped thing living inside the red blood cell. So Plasmodium is what causes malaria. So that's spread by mosquito bites. The one in the middle is another protozoan called Toxoplasma. And Toxoplasma gondii, that one causes toxoplasmosis. So that's a concern in pregnant women. This parasite is actually shed in the stool of cats. And if a woman is cleaning the litter box and her cat happens to be infected, which cats are only infected and can spread it to people only a couple weeks in their lifetime, and so it's pretty rare to have passed to humans. More commonly, you can get it from eating undercooked meat and also from vegetables, like root vegetables growing in the dirt that have been contaminated with cat feces. That's also another place where you can get this. But the concern in pregnant women is that it can cause miscarriages. And then the last protozoan we have is Cryptosporidium over here on the right, and that will cause diarrhea. So we actually had an outbreak of Cryptosporidium in Salt Lake a number of years ago, and it actually got into the pools. And chlorine does not kill it. So there were a lot of infections because it's pretty easy to get water in your mouth while you're swimming, and that's how it spread. And this is just showing you the life cycle of Plasmodium that causes malaria. They're pretty complicated. You do not have to memorize this, but just there's a lot of developmental stages that go on in their life cycle. And last one, protozoan called Bacillium coli. This is a ciliate, meaning that it is covered with cilia. So you can kind of see that on the bottom left picture here a little bit. It causes diarrhea. This is more of a problem in warmer countries. So usually you're not going to be infected with this here unless you get contaminated fruit or water that's been brought in from another country. And that's how you could get this.